North Carolina Courage. I'm excited to talk about this team because this is the team that kind of went through some things, right? Amongst all these other clubs going through some things in 2021, and looking ahead into 2022, kind of trying to solidify some things, right? So in terms of a team overview for North Carolina Courage, in terms of the head coaching position, they officially nabbed Sean Nahas as the head coach. He is someone who took over as the interim head coach on September 30th, and then officially on December 1st became the head coach of the North Carolina Courage. There was some chatter about whether or not this was going to be someone who, stood in this role, just because, Lisa, coming out of that, coming into the offseason, not out of that season, but going into the offseason, there were so many clubs looking to fill a head coaching position. And while there were whispers of it's likely going to be Nahas for the Courage, you just don't really know until you know. And then it became official for this club on December 1 to bring him into the fold.
It really did. And the players wanted Sean Nahas to be stepping into that role as head coach because he had been around the club for a while. He's been in the North Carolina soccer system for a while. I have a lot of friends that played youth soccer in North Carolina, and he was their coach. He has a really good feel and a really good soccer IQ and a good grasp on how this game works. And he's been an assistant at the club for a long time. He's seen the Courage go to NWSL championships and finals and win a lot of different trophies. So him sliding into that interim role towards the end of the 2021 season was really, really seamless. And then the murmurs from the players that were coached by him were that they wanted him to be named the full-time head coach. And ultimately that did come about. I think it's a really good hire, someone that can take this team in a good direction. And if he's already getting good, positive feedback from the players, that's huge. That is huge. Have the players have a say in their head coaches. So I'm excited for Sean Nahas to have a full season with this club. I think that's going to be a theme when we talk about each NWSL club. I know we talked about it with Gotham and Scott Parkinson, but for Sean Nahas, I think it'll be really good for him because he's been at the club for a while, and to now be able to walk into the first day of preseason and say, this is my team. This is my group of women and soccer players. What can I do with them? How can I make them better? How can I grow this team? How can I make us a championship team again? Because that's the pedigree that North Carolina is known for, and they didn't quite hit the mark last season. They fell short, let's be honest. And we'll get into our projections and everything like that, but I'm pumped for Nahas. Really, he's a pleasure to talk to and a pleasure to work with on the broadcasting side of things. And he's just a really smart soccer guy. He knows a lot about the game.
We'll see how he runs through preseason and full season eventually with the North Carolina Courage. They made some other notable hires, I think, on the sort of front office and administrative level as well. They fleshed out the coaching staff by bringing in Emma Thompson as an assistant coach and Francie Gotzigan as a club president ahead of the 2022 season. They closed out 2021 number 6 overall. So this is a North Carolina Courage side that made it to the playoffs once more, but they did so in a quarterfinal capacity. It was the first time they entered an NWSL playoffs as something other than the number 1 seed in several years. So their quarterfinal against the Washington Spirit, they ultimately were defeated 1-0, and Spirit obviously going on to win the 2021 championship. But they made their return to a playoff with a little bit of help, right, down the stretch of that 2021 season. And because of that little bit of a rocky finish, when we did take the time in the offseason to do our attacking third way too early power rankings predictions, we did put them in a lower ranking. We actually placed them at number 9, Lisa, just to sort of refresh your memory and everyone else out there.
Yeah, number 9. I mean, that's out of playoff contention. But again, this is way too early. We did these power rankings in early December. So that was before any offseason trades, any roster signings, before the NWSL 2022 draft, before the expansion draft, before anything happened. It was actually just a week or so after Sean Nahas was hired as the full-time head coach for the 2022 season. So these were very early predictions and power rankings of this team. But there has been a lot of off-season changes that have happened with every single club when you have 2 drafts in the off-season, and now with a CBA and different roster moves in place, there's been a lot of change at North Carolina Courage. This is one of the teams that I think has had some of the most movement and a lot of loss in this offseason. I know a lot of people are talking about Orlando Pride and all that they've lost, but Sandra, I really think we have to look at North Carolina honestly and kind of discuss all that they've lost. But let's start with all that they've gained, right? Because there comes a lot of breakout roster signings in the 2021 offseason and ahead of the 2022 seasons. Some rookies coming in, some veterans that were traded over to North Carolina. A lot of them happening. A few just to start: forward Jorian Baucom and midfielder Jordan Listro. They were both picked up off the waiver wire way early for North Carolina, coming over to this squad, and 2 players that maybe can provide a little bit in the attack for North Carolina, but otherwise some roster signings for North Carolina, a lot of them came at the defensive position.
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe that's the way to start this, right? Maybe look at the silver linings of things, because when we're looking at the offseason window, that trade window that took place, North Carolina was a team that was very, very active throughout that. And they were active throughout the duration of the offseason in terms of trying to make player acquisition. So in terms of some of their offseason signings, some of their breakout signings, we're talking about forward Jorian Baucom from formerly of Racing Louisville. They went out and they signed Jordan Listro. They made a move for Kiki Pickett, Katie Bowen. They brought in Brianna Pinto into the mix, bringing her back into the Tar Heels Nation, right? Sort of making that connection there. They went out and made a kind of a controversial signing, right? And bringing the return of Jaylene Daniels into the mix. And then they also navigated their NWSL draft probably in the best way that they can. I think if I remember correctly, during that NWSL draft, I kind of picked this franchise as a club to have kind of won that draft. I thought that they kind of addressed, 3 areas in their front line and their midfield and within their defensive back end to just come out with those 3 picks already in that first round. So a lot of college draft picks in the mix as well when we're looking at additions that they made into this offseason. But, they made some of these moves because they had some big losses along the way as well, right, Lisa?
They really did. I think that this is a club in North Carolina Courage that lost some of their biggest pieces, and it happened in waves, right, and in phases and small parts that were spread out, that ultimately it didn't look like a lot, but when you kind of look back at all the names and all the players that are no longer with North Carolina Courage, it's a little bit shocking. I mean, to look at some of them: midfielder Sam Mewis, she went to Kansas City, then her friend and podcast host forward Lynn Williams followed her to Kansas City later. Jess McDonald, a forward, headed to Racing Louisville. Forward Amy Rodriguez, she ended up retiring in this offseason. She's going to be an assistant coach at USC. Midfielder Kari Recaro to Angel City, and Haas James, Angar James, another midfielder, to Wave FC. So those last 2, Recaro and James, they were ahead of the expansion draft to get some expansion draft protection from Angel City and Wave FC respectively. But when you look at this list of players that are gone, and these are the biggest names, these were all starters last year for the most part, apart from some of the forward crew when Sam Mewis was hurt for a lot of last year. But between Lynn Williams, Jess McDonald, and Amy Rodriguez, they rotated through the starting front line. Kari Recaro and Angar James were always in that midfield box for North Carolina last year. These are a lot of big names. Sandra, for you, is there one in particular that is the most detrimental loss that North Carolina suffered?
I think you got to look at somebody like Sam Mewis. I think, and this is also sort of looking at it in hindsight, this is a player that throughout the duration of 2021 had to sort of operate and navigate some lingering injuries throughout that. But there's always this sort of thought in the back of your mind, well, you know what? It's like when Sam Mewis gets back in this starting lineup, you just wait till she gets back in this starting lineup. You just especially too, because of the pieces that they already did have on the pitch that were still part of that North Carolina Courage side that made that playoff run. Whether somebody like it was a Lynn Williams, or even alongside other midfield counterparts in a Dabinia, right? Or a Denise O'Sullivan. If you have a strong midfield in this league, it can really take you to places. And that's kind of where a lot of things are won and lost in this league. And sort of having that, when you see that move in Sam Mewis, making her departure, I think that was probably the biggest one. And I think it probably maybe was the early one where it's like the Band-Aid that if you rip it off real fast, you can kind of like move on. And I think it made kind of sense that it was the first kind of big loss that they had to open up and kick off their off season. But then all of a sudden you just sort of saw this like trickle down effect where like more and more starters clearly were having conversations about seeking opportunities elsewhere, and kind of obviously closing the chapter on their time with the North Carolina Courage and moving on to try to seek out other opportunities. And when we heard that directly from Lynn Williams, when we had an interview with her on Attacking Third, that your career is not as long as maybe you think it is, and sometimes you got to get out of your comfort zone and seek out different pastures and other opportunities. So we got to see that the departure of Lynn Williams, like you said, the Jess McDonald. I mean, even in something like we talked about that even during the Gotham preview, that there's also just the concept of retirements, that there are sometimes players who are just going to make that decision and say, hey, like, I'm out, I did this. And then that's another sort of off-season loss that maybe a franchise has to look at and see how they could possibly kind of fill that gap that's left behind. So I think you're kind of looking at this in both ways. You can look at it, in terms of like glass half full. You can look at it in terms of glass half empty. It really is sort of a flip of the coin, because when we're looking at how we broke this down from biggest, off-season signings to biggest losses, I think they kind of almost, I don't want to say they cancel each other out, but they definitely, you can maybe make an argument more for one case or one side than the other.
I think you can. I think that the losses that North Carolina suffered are bigger than the players that they gained. Just looking at names, experience, pedigree in this sport, and ability to be leaders, ability to really put a team on their back. I mean, say North Carolina just lost Lynn Williams, Jess McDonald, Amy Rodriguez, 3 forwards, really the players that scored all of their goals. If they still had a Sam Mewis in their midfield alongside a Dabinia and even a Kari Roccaro as that defensive player in the midfield to play in front of defenders, Abby Urseg and Merritt Mathias, they could be okay, because Sam Mewis is that creative leader, playmaker in the middle of the field that can take on that role of, I need to do everything for this squad moving down the pitch and into the attacking end. I need to be able to play those through balls, split the seams, find my forwards' feet, give the balls to them on a silver platter, and be creative in the midfield and not rely on their forwards. But when you throw in that Sam Mewis has also left, who are they going to lean on in the midfield? I think they still have a lot of experienced players in the midfield for North Carolina that can be creative and can do a lot, but they haven't had to do it all by themselves. And I think that it poses a lot of different questions for North Carolina moving forward.